Hi and welcome to Milieu Conversations. My name is Stephen Tracy and I'm the COO at Milieu Insight. This is the video series where we look at some interesting data about consumer opinion and behavior, and we have an even more interesting conversation with some experts on the topic. Today we're going to be talking about hustle culture, productivity at work, and everything related to people's views towards achieving good work-life balance at the workplace. And this is on the back of a survey that Milieu recently ran among Singaporean workers who are working full-time, where we asked them questions related to their mental well-being, job satisfaction, and a host of other questions. And I'm very excited to be joined by two wonderful experts on the topic today. Sitting closest to me is Edoardo Liotta. He's a journalist at Rice Media, which is a Singapore-based independent media outlet. And across from Edoardo is Sally Mounir, who is a psychotherapist and counselor at Intellect, as well as the School of Positive Psychology at Singapore. Thank you both for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for having us.
All right. So to kick things off, Edoardo, I want to throw one of the stats of the survey that we ran over to you. So we asked Singaporeans their state of mental health, and they were able to rank their mental health on a 7-point scale, where at the top of the scale, their mental health is very, very good, and at the bottom, it's very, very poor. We actually found that 57% of Singaporeans who are working full-time, so that's at least 35 hours per week or more, said that their mental health was in the good range, so good, very good, or extremely good. And I just wanted to start off by asking you, we know that mental health does kind of correlate with having a good work-life balance. And you both work in roles where you interface with lots of companies as a news outlet and as like a B2B e-health company. I'm curious what your opinion is on how good companies or how well companies, say in Singapore, are doing this right now. Do you think that there has been good progress on leadership at small and big companies in fostering a culture around better work-life balance, or do you feel that there's still a long ways to go? Did you want to start first, Edoardo?
I mean, my instinct to say there's still a long way to go, just because I guess on the journalism end, we're always focusing on the worst, right? Because we're always looking for stories. Not the worst necessarily, but like what often comes to us, or when people come to us, is when they're at their, at extremes. But we have, over the past year, starting in 2021, we did a series called Running on Empty.
Right.
About people in different professions who are burning out. And after I think we have about 6 to 8 episodes now, we've done, lawyers, doctors and stuff. I realized how bad the situation really is when you really hear what these people say, the hours they're working. But at the same time, I wouldn't say it's gotten worse. I would just say people are finally talking about it. Because when you hear these things, they're things that have been happening for 10, 20, forever in these professions. We're just finally starting to dismantle them or discuss them now. So I don't know if it's worse or just always been the same. The
topic of mental well-being has undoubtedly become more of a focus since the pandemic. A lot of the data we've collected has shown that. And I guess what we're also talking about now is, well, how fast is action taking place? And Sally, I guess the same question to you as well. You probably meet with a lot of business leaders and senior people at organizations. Are you finding that people are taking steps fast enough to build positive cultures at the workplace that support mental health and more work-life balance?
Yes, they are, but as Edoardo said, it's slow. It's very slow, and I think, in my experience at least, the employees are trying. So there is a lot of signing up, for example, for Intellect. The School of Positive Psychology is getting a lot of people, organizations are asking for it. But I feel from my experience, it's the structure up-down more than the employees themselves. The employees themselves are actually trying to see what can they do to be better. But we need a lot of work on the CEOs and the people who are managing them. HR, I think, will do greatly if they start applying a lot of the positive psychology or self-care kits with their employees, because HR is not only for trainings anymore or for, salary raises and bonuses anymore. They really, when they care about their people, it makes a difference. And the people I see are mainly burnt out already, and they try to apply, all the skills we teach them. But at the end of the day, how much can you apply if you're overworked even in the weekend, and every time you work, you're getting more work.
Right.
The reward is getting more work, so that's a tough thing to deal with for the human being who's trying to actually help themselves. Yeah.
An interesting idea there about like the movement towards nurturing a more positive culture and mental well-being coming from the bottom up instead of top down. I'm just curious, in your experience as well, have you noticed any differences between like small and big companies, like the big enterprise companies that with huge headcounts versus those smaller startups? I don't know if you've had the chance to work with both types, but have you noticed that how they are starting their journey towards fostering better mental health among employees? Has it been very different between those big and small companies?
Yeah, I've seen people coming from corporates that are mainly from Europe or America. Those have a very different culture because they come in with their culture and then they start developing that into Singapore. So it's more integrated and more supportive. And when I see their employees, you could see them talking about personal stuff more rather than work issues, because work issues are widely discussed with no really walls built there between them and their bosses. I cannot rule and say it's necessarily true that the CEO or the managers of that company are the issue, but it's also a culture, a history of that culture in the region in general, that people come in from where they grew up, their families, their schools, their universities, that's already there, and they apply it in the companies. And because how fast things are in Singapore, sometimes they don't stop and think. The pandemic definitely, I agree with Edoardo, has changed a lot, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Yeah. And Edoardo, I want to come back to you about something you said earlier about Rice has this kind of culture around like limited or no communications after certain hours. Now, that's interesting because as a news outlet, you know, there's immense pressure among media to pump out content. I don't think Rice does that. I'm a big fan of actually both your companies, both Intellect and Rice. I'm a regular reader of Rice, and I think if I could probably pin down you guys focus more on quality than quantity. I think that's not to say you don't put out a lot of content, but one of my questions here is with like the need to try and get content out for a company like an independent news organization. Can you just tell me a little bit about how a company or an organization like Rice manages the need to write about the news or what's happening in the world, and also manage those kind of times that you can communicate?
It's not that we don't ever work after hours. We do obviously sometimes have shoots on evenings and weekends, or if there's, like you said, something that's breaking in the news and we're responding to it, we will probably do what we need to do to get it out in time. But then we try not to do it too often, or like we do it when it's necessary or when we think it works. But B, also we have like systems in place where if you work really late one night, the next day maybe you have a half day, or if you work a whole weekend day, then maybe you take a weekday off. So we try to mitigate, I guess, where we can. Well, in that sense, also you don't overly normalize it, because you give and you take in a way. Yeah.
Well, one other follow-up on that is something I'm very interested, which is like when the company takes more from someone, you give it back. And I think that's something that I've observed not a lot of companies are good at doing, especially when there's like this, sometimes a demand for documentation. Like, oh, I worked out over hours, or I worked after hours. And a manager might be like, you can have those hours back, but you need to prove like that you work those hours through timesheets or whatever. And I'm also seeing in some of the business leaders that I've spoken to, some, particularly in the more startup or small company space, being more informal about this kind of stuff, where not everything needs to be documented. Is that kind of what you see at Rice as well? Is it when those hours are taken, like after hours or weekends, the giving it back to the staff is done more informally, or does there need to be like documentation?
It's pretty informal, I would say. In the first place, though, it's you don't really need to prove you've worked hours, just because if you're like on a shoot and then the content comes out, everyone knows in the company that that's what we were working on. But at the same time, I would say that there's not many questions asked, and generally managers are very understanding. Like if you're like, oh, I was a shoot late last night, so I'll be starting later tomorrow, or I worked all weekend, so I'll take a day later this week. Usually people are quite understanding and respect that boundary, obviously, unless there's something like really pressing. I guess it really just comes down to trust. I mean, to an extent you can have documentation and proof, but with that also comes this, I think, environment of non-trust, which then might indirectly be worse in other ways. So
Great. I want to move on to another stat from the survey, which is actually the same statistic where we ask people to rate their mental health. What we found is that when we cut it by the amount of hours that they're working, the people that reported working 60 hours or more, which is a lot of hours in a week, they generally have much lower mental health. So for example, 29% of those who work 60 hours or more report that they have poor, very poor, or extremely poor mental health, versus just 11% for the overall sample that we interviewed. So we know that there's obviously this tight correlation between mental health in general and the amount of hours that you work. Now, we'll get into this a little bit later on, but it's generally the people that work very, very long hours, like 60 hours or more. So what do you both think about like strategies for managing how often you work, both at the individual and the company level? So Sally, I'll throw this to you first. Do you have any thoughts on good strategies for managing the hours that you're working and clocking off at a certain time so you're not putting in 60 hours or more per week?
Again, for me, it's always up, down, not the other way around.
Right.
If your bosses and the people who got promoted and shine in the company exhibit this attitude of working 60 hours and above, and this is how they got there, if they're around the clock replying to emails at 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., the people who've just been employed, the younger people, will look at them and think, oh, this is how they did it. But it's not necessarily true. Some people will sleep 3-4 hours and it will be fine for them, but others not. So you need to lead by example. The CEOs, people I've seen higher up, managers, they're really very, very stressed and very, very lonely. And that loneliness comes with a price of what they've done. If they're not present with their families, if they're not engaged, if they don't have, they even lose the meaning sometimes. But I mean, I wish I could share stories, but they're very confidential. But it really is not as glamorous as it looks when they've overworked themselves that way. So if you lead by example, if you're a manager, if you're an HR manager, if you're a CEO, I would really, really highly recommend that you lead by example and show people that you don't need to work around the hour to accomplish.
Right.
I have a question for Sally. Is it like a vicious cycle, do you think, sometimes, where if you're like a manager or someone at the top, because you're lonely, or you put in so much work and therefore that takes up so much time that you become, I guess, lonely, and other parts of your life are not as vibrant, and therefore you try to fill that back in with more work and you get even more lonely? Is that sometimes the case?
This is a very good point. And it's also when you're stressed because you can't meet a lot of the family needs, for example, or cannot be the same person you used to be years ago, you become lonely because you don't have this thrive in your life anymore. And you don't have a lot to look forward to. So the bonuses are not the same, the achievements are not the same. The glamour may be there depending on the job and the company, but it's not the same anymore. And people also, depending on the culture, they might not approach you as easily. An approachable, this is a very good point that you've asked, because an approachable manager is the best. So if people feel they can knock on your door, call you, find you to talk to, it's very hard to become lonely and go into that vicious cycle. And the vicious cycle happens as well because if you're stressed at home, you would want to work more. Like people who even go to the gym and become addicts of sports. Sports is good, yeah, healthy and all good, but people are getting addicted to many habits because they're stressed somewhere else and they want to get that out in what is called healthy: gym, work, studies, whatever it is. So they do throw themselves into another addiction that gets them into loneliness again.
So let's go a little further in this too, because the idea of loneliness is, I think we were talking about that, or you were talking about that among like the more senior people in a way. Now, over the course of the pandemic, a lot of people have been working from home, and a lot of people are still working from home. And I sometimes wonder about, a lot of people have been stuck at home. They might feel the sense of loneliness too, especially if they don't have a big family network or extended friend network. How can people overcome issues or potential issues of loneliness when they're primarily working from home?
Yeah. Again, you will find me going back to the same point. It's the culture of the company. The culture of the company, if it allows people to connect with each other, if it develops that connection. Because if I've met a lot of people through Intellect who were just in a new job during the pandemic. So they just joined 2 months or 3 months ago, and they were already judging themselves on not knowing enough about the company or not being as engaged as the people they saw on Zoom. But then they would put their cameras off, invite people to put their cameras on if they're working from home, have one-on-one a lot of times with especially the new people, to make them feel welcome, to make them feel like, oh, we were all there when we started. We hired you for a reason. So even when I kept telling people, can't you think of why they would hire you in the middle of the pandemic, give you such an offer when companies are shutting down and laying out people? You must be worth something. But by that point, when they come to see a therapist, they're not there. They're really low, that they can't see their own value, and then you have to work on that. The support was good for them to have, but it took longer time because the culture of the company did not help. And also there were people all around the world who are not going through the same thing Singapore was going through, or maybe, Southeast Asia in general. Australia was going through different things. Every part of the world was going through a different thing. So people might not be relating, might not be at the same timeline. So even if they connect with a colleague who's overseas, they will not feel or see things the same way. So develop that connection, make meetings where people play games. Some companies did that, instead of going for company outing that we couldn't do anymore during the pandemic, make it an outing on Zoom, let people get to know each other, the real people, not just the titles.
Right.
Yeah.
And on the same topic, Edoardo, as an editor at Rice, I imagine you probably manage some people, or you have your own manager. But when it comes to like having discussions with a manager about, how you're doing, like a check-in, Sally, you talked about the importance of being approachable. Can you share some stories or experiences yourself in terms of either having that conversation with an employee or having it with your manager in a way that was productive? Like, how do you, sometimes you can see signals with someone who looks burnt out. Sometimes people are good at hiding it, and they don't want to talk about being burnt out. So what are some experiences that you've had in that, on that topic?
I think what has helped a lot that I can remember is just having a lot of very open and candid conversations with managers and colleagues and everyone about capacity, like how much work you have, but at the same time, and productivity, and at the same time also about like leave, time off, and stuff like that. Yeah. If you're always only talking about productivity and doing more work, that's going to also tip off the balance. You're going to feel overworked. If you're only talking about obviously going on leave on holiday, then that's probably not too healthy either. I would say what helps is being able to be candid about both. For example, with my manager, or one of my managers, he rarely goes on leave and he loves to work a lot. So sometimes you create this idea in your head like, oh my God, they're gonna expect me not to go on leave because they don't go on leave, like leading by example and stuff like that. But then sometimes like you just crack a joke and you just be candid and talk to them and be like, oh my God, why are you never on leave? Like, go on holiday, you need it. And then, or you talk to them about you wanting to go on leave, and then you see that actually maybe they don't mind at all if you do. And It just kind of breaks that elephant in the room sometimes. Yeah. And also just being candid, I think helps. It's the person allows.
It's interesting because you're kind of talking about the subtle things of like, I feel like there are many different types of managers in the world. Some that are more empathetic, some that are less empathetic. And there are, obviously you can teach someone to be a more empathetic leader, but sometimes I've met people in my own experience that they can read the books, but they really struggle to get to be like, to want to ask how your day is going before.
Emotional intelligence, yeah? Not for everyone.
It's something I think that people definitely need to train. It's something that every manager needs to learn about. But I think that's a great point, which is it's sometimes small talk, or just making sure that you're not always opening a meeting or a conversation with like, hey, where's the report? Or like, taking the time to say, how's it going? But also saying like, it sounds like you might've worked a little bit overtime. So make sure you take that time back and creating that kind of, that comfortable environment.
And also what I think really helps is also talking about, I think you said this, talking about not necessarily personal issues, but also what you do outside of work.
Yes.
Like what I notice helps is that you're always only talking about work. Then even when you have gatherings outside of work with your colleagues, you're also talking about work. It just feels a bit endless. But by talking about maybe what you do in your weekends, what you do in your evenings, like, I don't know, even your dating life, if that's something you're, open enough about, then that helps normalize having a life outside of work. Right. And when you hear other people talk about it, you're like, oh, okay, like I feel better about not always working 24/7, you know?
Going on to another data point, we asked about burnout in the survey. So we asked the respondents in general, how often do you feel a sense of burnout? And they could say anywhere from like every day, a couple times a week, all the way up to less than once a month. We actually found that 49% stated they feel burnout at least once a month or a few times a month or more, which is actually quite high. Like half of the full-time working population in Singapore feel burnout at least a couple times a month. Now there are, I think, burnout is a spectrum, and it can be extremely severe, it can be light, and it can be managed. But burnout is something I want to talk about. And actually this is something that Rice has written about a lot. And I can't remember the journalist's name, but there was a great article written, I think last year, that talked about work-life balance and the importance of it, trying to achieve balance and not becoming burnt out by focusing on within, which is, so the quote here was, secret to job satisfaction is to care less about the outcomes. This starts at the individual level with an understanding of our physical and emotional limitations. But in another article, there's another interesting topic, which is burnout, or things that lead to burnout stem from organizational structures. And these are both really fascinating articles. And I think the reality is probably somewhere in between, which is it's a mix of an individual kind of managing their workload and knowing their boundaries, and also creating a positive work environment. But first question off of that is, what do you think where the responsibility lies in terms of, is it the individual or the company to take hold of not becoming burnt out? Do you think it's the biggest responsibilities on the company culture, or is it on the individual and their work ethic?
I definitely think the biggest responsibility is on the company, just because it is so much harder when you're one small piece in a bigger structure to shout upwards than someone coming to you and being like, okay, how's it going? At the same time, I will say though, it is also your responsibility to make your boundaries clear. Right. Because I have noticed, and it's happened to me as well, where you're like, oh, I'm fine, I can do this work. And then they're like, okay, well then here's more work. And then you're like, okay, I'm still okay. And they're like, okay, well here's more work. And you can get upset at the company, but at the same time, that's on you maybe for not communicating to them, like, oh, this is too much for me. I've been working this many hours. So on the flip side is, can you blame them if you also never raised it as an issue? So I would say definitely on a personal level, you have to make it clear as well what your limitations are. That said, of course, there will always be times when you have to work more. There'll be times when you do overtime. I mean, reality is reality, but at the same time, being transparent and clear about where that limit is.
But as Edoardo said, it's also the person. So if we get people, I think it trickles also from the educational system, the person and their life with their own family. If they weren't people who would speak up to their parents, for example, which is culturally not accepted in some places, then how are you going to speak up when you go to your work? It's not in you as a person.
Yeah, I think the family, what I want to ask too is like the strategies for the individuals to become better at managing their own workload as well. But you gave a great example there, which is like sometimes the baggage people bring from their personal life or their family life. I've also seen it with like people who come in from different companies. Sometimes they come in from a big company that has a very top-down structure, and they come in and we're trying to adjust them to our culture, which is, you know, more focused on work-life balance and having bringing people in that are passionate about what they do.
Definitely.
But sometimes you find that baggage from other companies where they had borderline traumatic experience.
Very true. So I'm originally Egyptian. I studied in the American University in Cairo. And there I've learned to speak up. We learned to challenge the professors, talk, debate, research. Never was it ever a book that confined us into what we're going to do later on. So it taught me a lot about this culture. And then years later, when I came to Singapore after 30 years of being an expat all my life, so with my family, I then discovered the scope of psychology and I studied there. And yes, it's a very, very diverse culture. A lot of people there come from all around the world, but some of the classes I've been to, if the majority is from Southeast Asia or people who came from more conservative cultures, no one asked any questions. Not that they were not curious or smart, they were very, very smart. Actually, they were very challenging for me when it came to exams or presentations or all that stuff. But they wouldn't speak up. It's the culture. And it's not respectful if you would speak up, and I could see how uncomfortable they were sometimes when I would ask a question and just go on and on about questioning, you know. So it's the culture, and if you teach that in schools, I think people will grow up to know that asking a question is not disrespectful. There's a very fine line between that and being curious and inquisitive. Yeah. Right. So I think that would help if people would approach their managers. Yes, it's the culture of the company, I would say 70%, but also it's the person. If already they have this thinking in their mind, to break it, it will take time.
No, I definitely feel that, because I mean, I grew up in Singapore, and my company, everyone's pretty much Singaporean, so it took me also a long time to learn how to ask and speak up with managers, just because I guess I was also kind of ingrained in that way that you just don't until you're at breaking point, you know, which is also so unhealthy. Like, you should bring it up before you get to that point. Yeah, I feel that.
That's really interesting. I think the next thing I want to talk about more is hustle culture. So we've talked a little bit about mental well-being, productivity, and also some other things like how companies can create more positive and kind of warm cultures. But the idea of hustle culture is something that some people really buy into at all levels and all ages. There's this really funny Reddit subreddit called LinkedIn Lunatics, which I can't get enough of, that posts from LinkedIn, and I'm afraid I might appear on here one day, but of people that are doing things on LinkedIn. And one thing you see a lot is things I would categorize as hustle culture, people talking about the importance of just like working nonstop to accomplish your dreams and things like that. And I think that there is a group of people, there's a cohort that really do believe in it. And we actually found that there were segments where job satisfaction did correlate with higher hours. Now, it depends. If you break through 60 hours a week, that's where mental health and job satisfaction tends to fall off a cliff. But we actually found that job satisfaction was fairly high, if not higher, among people who worked up to 60 hours, between 45 to 60, which not everyone's going to like that statistic. But one of my questions is, in any workplace, there's going to be different personalities and different views. And some people are going to be really ambitious and want to just hustle and get stuff done. Other people are going to want to find that balance, and other people are going to be also different. What are your thoughts on these personalities coexisting, and how can a company kind of manage these kind of different personalities? So Sally, maybe I'll start with yourself.
Okay, so I think hustle culture doesn't only fall into the fact that people work over hours as in work. So it could be a lot of other things. That is also, I think globally, it's been encouraged by universities and Ivy League universities, and what kind of jobs you would get and all that. So you're supposed to have 4 or 5 years of experience when you're a new graduate with a bachelor's degree. Where are you gonna get that? So it's the encouragement around the world of what you are and what you've achieved by the time you've already just graduated from a bachelor's degree. If you've graduated from a bachelor's degree, it's never enough anymore. You need a master's. And when you're done with the master's, then what? Another master's or something else. It's always pushing for more in terms of your development in your career. And this is how you achieve. So if that culture moves away a little bit, now that we have young startups that have made it like Intellect and more around the world, it's very encouraging and promising to see young people developing this. And I think this generation is going better because it's pushing for that. It's pushing for not the norm that we used to have years ago, the older norm in my generation. And it's moving towards, okay, so who are you? What do you want to do with your life, So the hustle culture and what it used to be is changing, I think. Very slow, but it is changing a lot. And if you're rewarded for being an achiever, you will want to achieve more. So if you've been rewarded all your life for getting A's, you will want to continue to get A's. If you've been rewarded because you've overworked, then that's what success means to you. And this is why we have a big crash before, like when you're in your career, your identity and who you are and how much you relate to this career, versus after you retire. For example, for the people who have to retire at some point in time, they're lost. They don't know who they are anymore, even if they have a family, even if they have, like, how to belong to that again. So always the balance will be the great thing. And I think it's, yes, higher up, down, but also if we integrate it into schools, normalize that. If, I get some students, 17-year-olds, for example, and they would say, I'm in my JCs or doing my IBs and things like that. And they're already super stressed. They're not even in university yet, because it's only the higher up that are appreciated. And teachers would go and, reward and appreciate people for their grades. How about appreciating people for who they are, for their character, for how friendly they are, how kind they are? Yeah, achievements are good, but then just balance it out so that it's normalized, and then those other people who don't fall in the highly academic or highly achieving can still find a place to fit in and can still feel the passion of being themselves and get creative. Kids and people will be very creative if you believe in them. So the hustle culture can be broken down by time, I think. But yeah, it's looked at as, if I go to the gym that amount of hours, if I go to the doctors, if I do certain things in my life, even in the weekends, when you ask people who don't work around the clock in the weekends, there always has to be like a set plan. Like Edoardo said, when you take time off, when you travel, it's not necessarily fun all the time. Sometimes people have an agenda even when they're traveling to places they go. They hop from one place to the other, and then they end up wanting a holiday from the holiday. So how to balance that? How to have the idea of, okay, I'm chilling, I'm doing nothing, and I'm happy with that. I'm okay with doing nothing. Doing nothing is frowned upon, for sure. So.
Right. So, I mean, it's an interesting answer, because you talked about the hustle culture as a concept being reinforced, not just in the confines of an office, but even before that, in school and university, which makes the problem a lot bigger. Like, it's something that really needs to change at multiple levels.